The Library of Congress houses extensive documentation of the legal and social barriers faced by free Black Americans before the Civil War. But few cases reveal the devastating consequences of anti-miscegenation laws as clearly as the story of interracial couples who dared to marry, despite knowing they would face exile, legal persecution, and decades of fighting for basic recognition of their unions. On a morning in June 2025, historian Dr. Rebecca Chen opens a package that will lead her to uncover one of the most poignant stories of love and resistance she has encountered. The case of a free Black man named Samuel, who in 1803 married a white woman named Elizabeth in Pennsylvania, where such marriages were legal, who attempted to return to Virginia, where both had family, who were forced into permanent exile when Virginia authorities threatened to enslave Samuel and prosecute Elizabeth, and who spent 40 years fighting for legal recognition of their marriage, for the right to inherit property from each other, and for their children to be recognized as legitimate, a fight that would not be resolved until after the Civil War, when anti-miscegenation laws were temporarily invalidated, and the couple, now elderly, could finally return to Virginia and have their marriage legally acknowledged. The donation comes from a historical society in Pennsylvania that has been researching free Black communities in the early 19th century and the legal challenges they faced. The letter explains that while examining materials from the early 1800s, researchers discovered extensive documentation of Samuel and Elizabeth's marriage in 1803, their forced exile from Virginia, and their decades-long legal struggle for recognition, including correspondence, legal documents, and testimony given in the 1860s, reflecting on their 40-year ordeal. Rebecca carefully removes the materials from their archival box. The first item is a photograph, styled like an 18th-century parlor scene, showing a Black man and a white woman in what appears to be a moment of intense conversation or confrontation. The man stands in a doorway, one arm braced high against the frame, his posture creating both a barrier and a focal point. He wears formal dark clothing with large metallic buttons and ruffled cuffs, attire suggesting a person of some means rather than a servant, despite what such clothing might typically indicate for a Black man in this era. His gaze is fixed on the woman with steady, focused intensity. The woman stands just inside an adjoining room, holding what appears to be a book or document close to her chest. Her dress, light-colored with fitted bodice and lace trim, marks her as a woman of refinement. Her expression shows concentration and quiet resolve, as if listening to something difficult. One hand hovers near his chest without quite touching, creating charged space between them. The room behind features patterned wallpaper and framed portraits, suggesting domestic comfort and wealth. What strikes Rebecca most powerfully is the tension in the scene. This is not a romantic tableau, but rather a moment of confrontation or revelation. Two people caught in a conversation that matters deeply. Rebecca turns the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, commemorative photograph representing Samuel and Elizabeth, 1870s, staged to document their story. Samuel, a free Black man, married Elizabeth, a white woman, in Pennsylvania in 1803. When they attempted to return to Virginia, they were forced into exile under threat that Samuel would be enslaved and Elizabeth prosecuted. They spent 40 years in Pennsylvania fighting for legal recognition of their marriage. After the Civil War, they finally returned to Virginia and had their marriage legally acknowledged. This photograph commemorates their struggle, And below that, in different handwriting, added much later. They married in 1803 when he was 28 and she was 25. They lived in exile for 40 years, their marriage unrecognized in Virginia, their children considered illegitimate by Virginia law. They fought through letters, petitions, and legal challenges. Only after the Civil War could they return home and have their union recognized. This is their story of love and endurance against laws designed to keep them apart. Rebecca reads the inscription 3 times, her chest tightening. Samuel and Elizabeth had married legally in Pennsylvania in 1803, but Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws, which prohibited marriages between white people and black people, made it impossible for them to live in Virginia as a married couple. They had been forced into 40 years of exile, fighting for recognition of a marriage that was legal where they lived, but criminalized in the state where they both had roots and family. Rebecca spends the rest of that day examining the other materials in the package. What she finds allows her to piece together Samuel and Elizabeth's complete story through marriage records, correspondence spanning 4 decades, legal documents from their various attempts to gain recognition, and testimony they gave in the 1860s reflecting on their experience. From the marriage record, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, June 15, 1803. Samuel Freeman, free black man, age 28, of Virginia, and Elizabeth Morrison, white woman, age 25, of Virginia, were joined in lawful marriage this day in the presence of witnesses. Both parties affirm they enter this union freely and of their own accord. From a letter written by Samuel in August 1803 to a friend in Virginia. Elizabeth and I were married in Pennsylvania in June. We had hoped to return to Virginia, where both our families reside, but we have learned that our marriage is illegal in Virginia under laws that prohibit unions between black and white persons. We have been advised that if we return to Virginia as a married couple, I could be enslaved under Virginia law, as free black people who violate certain laws can lose their free status, and Elizabeth could be prosecuted and fined. We are devastated. We married legally and in good faith. We love each other and wish to build a life together. But Virginia law treats our lawful marriage as a crime. We have decided to remain in Pennsylvania, where our union is recognized. But this means permanent separation from our families in Virginia. This is the price we must pay for having married across the color line. From a letter written by Elizabeth in 1805 to her sister in Virginia. I have not seen you or our parents in 2 years now, and it pains me deeply. Samuel and I have a daughter, born last month. We named her Margaret. She is healthy and beautiful, but under Virginia law, our marriage is not recognized, which means Margaret would be considered illegitimate if we lived in Virginia. This is unbearable. Our lawful marriage and our legitimate child denied recognition simply because Samuel is black and I am white. Samuel has established a successful carpentry business here in Pennsylvania. We are building a good life, but we are in exile from our home, from our families, from the place where we both were raised. All because Virginia cannot accept that 2 people of different races might love each other and wish to build a life together as equals. Rebecca finds extensive correspondence spanning the next 40 years, documenting Samuel and Elizabeth's repeated attempts to gain legal recognition of their marriage in Virginia. They wrote letters to Virginia legislators petitioning for exceptions to the anti-miscegenation law. They sought legal opinions about whether their Pennsylvania marriage might be recognized in Virginia under principles of interstate comity. They tried various legal strategies to establish that their children were legitimate and could inherit property. All of these efforts failed. Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws were absolute. Marriages between black people and white people were void, regardless of where they were performed. Children of such unions were considered illegitimate. The couple could not inherit from each other. If they returned to Virginia, Samuel risked enslavement and Elizabeth risked prosecution. From a legal opinion received by Samuel in 1825. I have reviewed your case carefully. While your marriage was legal in Pennsylvania, where it was performed, Virginia law is clear that marriages between Negro and white persons are void. Virginia courts will not recognize your Pennsylvania marriage. If you and your wife were to reside in Virginia as a married couple, you would be subject to prosecution, and as a free Negro who has violated Virginia law, you could potentially lose your free status. I understand this is devastating, but Virginia's laws on this matter are absolute and show no signs of changing. My advice is that you remain in Pennsylvania, where your marriage is recognized, and where you can live without fear of prosecution. Rebecca finds correspondence between Samuel and Elizabeth and their family members in Virginia. Samuel's mother, who was free, wrote regular letters expressing her grief at not seeing her son or meeting her grandchildren. Elizabeth's parents initially refused contact, but eventually began writing, expressing sadness at their separation from their daughter, but stating they could not support a marriage that violated Virginia law and social norms. From a letter from Elizabeth's mother in 1830, "It has been 27 years since you married Samuel and left Virginia. Your father and I are aging, and we grieve that we have not seen you or known your children. We do not approve of your marriage. It violates both law and the natural order that God established. But you are still our daughter, and we love you despite the choices you have made. We wish circumstances were different, but Virginia law is clear, and you cannot return while maintaining your illegal union." Rebecca finds financial records showing that Samuel built a successful carpentry business in Pennsylvania, and that the family achieved modest prosperity. They had 5 children between 1805 and 1820. Samuel purchased a home in 1815. Elizabeth worked as a seamstress. By all accounts, they built a stable, loving family life in Pennsylvania. But the correspondence makes clear that the exile weighed heavily on both of them. They were separated from extended family, from their roots, from the place they considered home. Their marriage, while legal in Pennsylvania, carried social stigma even there. Their children faced discrimination because of their mixed-race heritage. From Samuel's testimony given in 1868, "My name is Samuel Freeman. I am now 93 years old. I am giving this testimony to document the 40 years Elizabeth and I spent in exile from Virginia because we dared to marry across the color line. I was born free in Virginia in 1775. My mother was a free black woman. I learned carpentry and worked as a skilled tradesman. In 1802, I met Elizabeth Morrison, who was white. We fell in love. We both understood that marriage between us would be illegal in Virginia. So in 1803, we traveled to Pennsylvania and were legally married there. We had hoped we might return to Virginia and that our Pennsylvania marriage would be recognized. But we learned quickly that Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws were absolute. Our marriage was considered void in Virginia. If we returned, I could be enslaved for violating the law, and Elizabeth could be prosecuted. We made the decision to remain in Pennsylvania. This meant permanent exile from our families, from our home, from Virginia. For 40 years we lived in Pennsylvania. We raised 5 children. I built a successful carpentry business. We had a good life in many ways. But we were always in exile. We could not return to Virginia. We could not visit family there without risking arrest. Our children could not know their grandparents in Virginia. Our marriage was not recognized in the state where we were born. For 40 years, we fought for recognition. We wrote letters to Virginia legislators. We sought legal opinions. We tried every avenue we could think of to have our marriage acknowledged in Virginia. Everything failed. Virginia's laws were absolute. Then came the Civil War. Slavery ended. The social order that had sustained anti-miscegenation laws was disrupted. In 1866, Elizabeth and I, now elderly, both in our 80s, made the decision to return to Virginia. Virginia's anti-miscegenation law was still on the books, but enforcement was uncertain in the chaos of Reconstruction. We returned to Virginia in 1867. We filed papers documenting our Pennsylvania marriage. We petitioned for legal recognition. In 1868, a Virginia court finally recognized our marriage. After 40 years, the marriage we had contracted legally in 1803 was acknowledged in Virginia. We were 93 and 90 years old. We had been married for 65 years. But for 40 of those years, our marriage had been unrecognized in our home state. I am giving this testimony because I want our story documented. I want people to understand what anti-miscegenation laws cost, not just in abstract legal terms, but in human terms. Elizabeth and I lost 40 years with our families in Virginia. Our children grew up not knowing their grandparents. We could not inherit property from Virginia relatives. We could not visit home without fear of arrest. All because we married across the color line. We were fortunate in many ways. We had each other. We built a good life in Pennsylvania. We raised children who thrived. But we paid a terrible price for loving each other. That price was 40 years of exile. Anti-miscegenation laws are not abstract legal principles. They are tools of racial hierarchy that punish people for loving across racial lines. They separate families, force people into exile, deny children their legitimacy, and create a legal system where love is a crime if it crosses the color line. Elizabeth and I are now both very elderly. We have been married for 65 years. We endured 40 years of exile for our marriage. We fought for recognition for 4 decades. And finally, in our 80s, we achieved legal recognition in Virginia. But we are the lucky ones. How many other couples were kept apart by these laws? How many people never married because they knew their union would be illegal? How many families were separated? How many children were denied legitimacy? How many people lived in fear because anti-miscegenation laws made love across the color line a crime? I document our story so that future generations will understand the human cost of laws designed to enforce racial separation. Elizabeth and I loved each other. We married legally. And for that, we paid with 40 years of exile. From Elizabeth's testimony, also given in 1868, "My name is Elizabeth Freeman. I married Samuel Freeman in Pennsylvania in 1803. We have been married for 65 years. For 40 of those years, our marriage was not recognized in Virginia, the state where we were both born. I chose to marry Samuel knowing the consequences. I knew our marriage would be illegal in Virginia. I knew I would be separated from my family. I knew we would face social condemnation. But I loved Samuel, and I believed then, and believe now, that laws prohibiting marriage between people of different races are fundamentally wrong. The 40 years we spent in Pennsylvania were good years in many ways. We built a life together, raised children, created a home, but we were always in exile. I never saw my parents after I left Virginia in 1803. They died while I was in Pennsylvania, and I could not attend their funerals because returning to Virginia would mean Samuel's arrest. I do not regret marrying Samuel. He has been a loving husband, a devoted father, and a good man for 65 years. But I grieve the cost. I grieve the 40 years of separation from my family. I grieve that my children never knew their grandparents in Virginia. I grieve that for 40 years, the state where I was born refused to recognize my marriage and declared my children illegitimate. We have finally received recognition in Virginia. Our marriage is now legally acknowledged. But we are both 90 years old. We should have had this recognition 40 years ago. We should have been able to live in Virginia as a married couple, to raise our children near our families, to be acknowledged as what we always were, two people joined in lawful matrimony. I document our story because I want people to understand that anti-miscegenation laws are not abstract legal principles. They are cruel instruments that punish love and separate families. Samuel and I paid with 40 years of exile. Others have paid even more dearly. These laws must end. Rebecca contacts Dr. James Mitchell, a historian at the University of Virginia, who specializes in anti-miscegenation laws and their impact on families in the early American Republic and antebellum period. James has spent decades researching how these laws functioned, how they were enforced, and what consequences they had for people who dared to marry across the color line. James calls her back within hours, his voice filled with emotion. Samuel and Elizabeth's story, if you have their complete testimony and 40 years of correspondence documenting their exile, would be one of the most comprehensive accounts we have of how anti-miscegenation laws operated in practice and what they cost in human terms. Send me everything. Rebecca shares all materials with James. They arranged to meet at the Virginia Historical Society to examine Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws, court records from similar cases, and any additional documentation about interracial marriages in the early 1800s. Over the following weeks, Rebecca and James pieced together the complete story through Samuel and Elizabeth's testimony. Their correspondence, legal documents, and extensive historical research about anti-miscegenation laws in Virginia and other states. From their research, they established that Virginia's anti-miscegenation law dated to 1691 and prohibited marriages between white people and black people, as well as Native Americans. The law declared such marriages void and imposed penalties, including fines, and for free black people, potential loss of free status. The law remained in effect continuously from 1691 until 1967, when the Supreme Court finally struck down all anti-miscegenation laws in Loving versus Virginia. They find that Pennsylvania, where Samuel and Elizabeth married, had no anti-miscegenation law in 1803, making their marriage legal there. But Virginia refused to recognize marriages from other states if those marriages violated Virginia law. Meaning, Samuel and Elizabeth's Pennsylvania marriage was void in Virginia. They find similar cases of couples forced into exile. From court records, they find several cases of free black men who married white women in northern states, and then were prosecuted when they returned to Virginia. In most cases, the men were enslaved or forced to leave Virginia permanently. They trace what happened to Samuel and Elizabeth after their testimony in 1868. From census records and church documents, they find that both lived in Virginia for several years after finally receiving recognition of their marriage. Samuel died in 1871 at age 96. Elizabeth died in 1873 at age 95. They are buried together in a cemetery in Virginia with a shared headstone that reads, Samuel and Elizabeth Freeman, married 1803, recognized 1868, together forever. They find that 3 of Samuel and Elizabeth's 5 children survived to adulthood, all living in Pennsylvania, where they faced less severe discrimination than they would have in Virginia. Several grandchildren are documented in later records. Over the following months, Rebecca and James worked to create an exhibition examining anti-miscegenation laws and their human impact, using Samuel and Elizabeth's 40-year exile as a central case study. They work with legal historians to provide context about how these laws functioned across different states and time periods. 23 months after Rebecca first opened that package, the Library of Congress opens the exhibition 40 Years in Exile, Samuel and Elizabeth Freeman's Fight Against Anti-Miscegenation Laws. The exhibition occupies a gallery designed to examine anti-miscegenation laws, not as abstract legal principles, but as instruments that separated families and forced people into exile. The centerpiece is the commemorative photograph from the 1870s, staged to represent Samuel and Elizabeth's story, showing a moment of intense conversation that captures both the depth of their relationship and the challenges they faced. A detailed explanation accompanies the image. This photograph from the 1870s was staged to commemorate Samuel and Elizabeth Freeman's story. In 1803, Samuel, a free black man, and Elizabeth, a white woman, legally married in Pennsylvania. When they attempted to return to Virginia, they were forced into permanent exile. Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws made their marriage void and threatened Samuel with enslavement. For 40 years, they lived in Pennsylvania, separated from their families in Virginia, fighting for legal recognition of their marriage. Only after the Civil War, when they were in their 80s, did Virginia finally recognize their union. They had been married 65 years, but spent 40 of those years unrecognized in their home state. The exhibition tells Samuel and Elizabeth's complete story through their testimony, their 40 years of correspondence, legal documents from their attempts to gain recognition, and documentation of their final years in Virginia after recognition was achieved. One section examines anti-miscegenation laws broadly, their origins in colonial Virginia in 1691, their spread to other states, their function as tools to enforce racial hierarchy, and their persistence until 1967. Maps show which states had such laws and when they were enacted or repealed. Another section focuses on Samuel and Elizabeth's specific experience, their 1803 marriage in Pennsylvania, their discovery that they could not return to Virginia, their decision to remain in Pennsylvania in permanent exile, their 40 years of correspondence with family members they could not visit, their repeated attempts to gain legal recognition, and their finally receiving recognition in 1868 when they were 93 and 90 years old. The exhibition includes extensive excerpts from their correspondence over 40 years, showing the human cost of exile, missing family events, being unable to attend parents' funerals, children not knowing grandparents, constant awareness that their marriage was considered criminal in their home state. A section on similar cases shows that Samuel and Elizabeth were not unique. Numerous interracial couples were forced into similar exiles or were separated entirely by anti-miscegenation laws. The exhibition documents several comparable cases to show this was a systematic feature of racial hierarchy in America. The exhibition traces the aftermath. Samuel and Elizabeth's return to Virginia in 1867, their court petition for recognition in 1868, their final years living legally as a married couple in Virginia, their deaths in the early 1870s, and their shared burial with a headstone commemorating their 65-year marriage. A timeline shows the long history of anti-miscegenation laws, from Virginia's 1691 law through the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and finally to Loving-Vythe, Virginia, in 1967, when the Supreme Court struck down all remaining anti-miscegenation laws as unconstitutional. A video plays continuously featuring historians discussing anti-miscegenation laws, legal scholars examining how these laws functioned, and descendants of interracial couples reflecting on their ancestors' experiences. On opening day, Rebecca stands in the gallery, watching visitors engage with the exhibition. She sees people study the commemorative photograph, understanding it represents a couple who spent 40 years in exile because their love crossed the color line. James stands beside her. Samuel and Elizabeth married in 1803 when he was 28, and she was 25, he says quietly. They were legally married in Pennsylvania. But Virginia law declared their marriage void and threatened Samuel with enslavement if they returned. So they spent 40 years in Pennsylvania, raising children, building a life, but always in exile from home and family. They fought for recognition for 4 decades. Finally, in 1868, when they were 93 and 90, Virginia recognized their marriage. They had been married 65 years. This is what anti-miscegenation laws cost in human terms: 40 years of exile, 4 decades of separation from family, a lifetime of fighting for recognition of a love that should never have been criminalized. A young interracial couple approaches Rebecca and James after spending a long time reading the correspondence. "We just got married last year," the woman says, tears in her eyes. Reading about Samuel and Elizabeth, understanding they spent 40 years in exile, that they couldn't see their families, that their children couldn't know their grandparents, all because they married across the color line. It's overwhelming. We can marry freely now because people like Samuel and Elizabeth fought for recognition despite terrible costs. Their 40-year exile helped prove that anti-miscegenation laws were cruel and unjust. An elderly man stops to read Samuel's testimony for a long time. Samuel says anti-miscegenation laws were tools of racial hierarchy that punish people for loving across racial lines. He says thoughtfully. He understood these laws weren't about morality or nature. They were about enforcing racial separation and white supremacy. He and Elizabeth paid with 40 years of exile. They document that cost so we would understand what these laws did to real people and real families. A legal historian examines the section on Virginia's recognition of the marriage in 1868. "This is fascinating," she says. "Virginia's anti-miscegenation law was still on the books in 1868. It wasn't repealed until 1967. But in the chaos of Reconstruction, a court recognized Samuel and Elizabeth's Pennsylvania marriage. That recognition was extraordinary and wouldn't have been possible before the Civil War. It shows how the war disrupted racial hierarchies enough to create brief opportunities for legal recognition that would later be closed again during Jim Crow." Throughout the day, visitors engage deeply with the exhibition, understanding that Samuel and Elizabeth's story represents both the cruelty of anti-miscegenation laws and the courage of couples who married despite knowing they would face exile, legal persecution, and decades of fighting for recognition. As the museum prepares to close that evening, Rebecca walks through the gallery one more time. She stops in front of the commemorative photograph, looking at the staged scene that represents Samuel and Elizabeth's story. She thinks about their lives, marrying in Pennsylvania in 1803 when he was 28 and she was 25, discovering they could not return to Virginia without risking Samuel's enslavement and Elizabeth's prosecution, spending 40 years in Pennsylvania, separated from families and fighting for recognition, finally returning to Virginia in 1867 when they were in their 80s, receiving legal recognition of their marriage in 1868, living their final years as a legally recognized couple in their home state, dying in the early 1870s having been married 65 years, but recognized in Virginia for only the final few years of their lives. She thinks about the correspondence spanning 40 years, letters to family members they could not visit, petitions to legislators who would not change the law, legal opinions that confirmed their exile, expressions of grief at missing parents' funerals and children not knowing grandparents, determination to keep fighting for recognition despite decades of failure. And she thinks about their final testimony in 1868, elderly, having finally achieved recognition, but documenting the terrible cost so future generations would understand what anti-miscegenation laws did to people who dared to love across the color line. The photograph waited approximately 150 years to tell Samuel and Elizabeth's complete story. The staged image representing their relationship has become testimony to love that persisted despite 40 years of exile, to a fight for recognition that lasted 4 decades, and to the human cost of laws designed to enforce racial separation by criminalizing interracial marriage. Now the photograph and exhibition have fulfilled a purpose Samuel and Elizabeth surely would have wanted. Their story has been documented completely. Their 40-year exile has been recognized as a terrible injustice. Their fight for recognition has been honored. And future generations can understand that anti-miscegenation laws were not abstract legal principles, but cruel instruments that separated families, forced couples into exile, and punished people for the crime of loving across racial lines. Samuel and Elizabeth Freeman married legally in 1803 and spent the next 40 years fighting for Virginia to acknowledge what Pennsylvania already recognized, that they were husband and wife, that their children were legitimate, that their love deserved legal protection. They finally won that recognition in 1868 when they were 93 and 90 years old, having been married 65 years, but recognized in their home state for only the final years of their lives. A bittersweet victory that documented both the persistence of their love and the cruelty of the laws that had kept them in exile for 4 decades.